Well, as we roll the calendar over to the month of October, we have plenty to discuss when it comes to weather. Joining us now, Eric Snodgrass with Nutrient Ag Solutions to give us an update on what he is seeing here and what that forecast looks like for the week ahead and more. And Eric, thanks for joining me as always. And looking over the past weekend here, saw some rain in parts of the upper Midwest, I know, and then really hot. I mean, I'm spending some time in Iowa. It's 90 degrees for the end of September. That is really, really hot for this time of year, Eric.
Yeah, that last week of September in the Midwest, upper Midwest, that Iowa, Minnesota area was the hottest on record, actually. So there were several climate reporting districts that put down their new warmest such days in a row there at the end
Mhm.
of September, and it was pretty hot. And then when do you see the flip in temperatures coming later this week? So it was interesting this morning. I was looking at the overnight lows, which are about 30 degrees warmer than normal in parts of the upper Midwest. By the time we get into this next weekend, where there's frost risk, we're actually going to see this morning's lows being about 20 degrees warmer than Saturday's highs. So
Wow.
it's October, get ready for it. But you mentioned weekend rains, and you're right, we did get some in the upper Midwest. Is it enough to overcome the deficits in Mississippi? No. What also happened this weekend is we saw just a tremendous amount of flooding that hit parts of New York. I'm sure that a lot of folks saw that,
Mhm.
of course, in the news. To be honest, when you look at all of the data, that's a relatively isolated event. It was locally extremely heavy rainfall, but relatively isolated. So yeah, we've got plenty to be talking about here. We do have wide open harvest windows, but that comes at a cost. So there's a lot to be discussing with precipitation patterns going forward.
Well, and let's talk about that a little bit more, a little bit of a longer range outlook for October. But you mentioned that frost risk as well. How widespread of a frost risk are we looking at here as we get towards next weekend?
Yeah, I mean it's coming through the Western Plains first and the Northern Plains, and of course that's after Canada. This is at the end of the week, so we've still got some places in the Midwest still have a few more days of the heat that's going to be on before this gets here. At this point, I do see it getting as far south as Nebraska and parts of Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, probably touching pockets of northern Illinois, getting into the Great Lakes states. But there's also the chance a lot of those folks get down to 35 rather than down there
Hmm.
below freezing. What's interesting is it doesn't matter this year. The crop finished, right? I mean, I've driven all over the Midwest and flown over, and people are harvesting. There's not a crop that's still vulnerable to this. So unlike a year where we're worried about it, like had this happened in 2019 when we didn't plant the crop until June, we would have been toast. Like this would have been
Hmm.
terrible. So this is a non-event overall, which is a good thing, I think, to think about. But yeah, it's going to be a pretty big swing. And by the way, the pattern's open; it's moving. So we're going
Hmm.
to dip these temperatures down, and then you watch right after it. We're going to bounce back up again. I don't think we're going to bounce back up to get into the heat you just saw, but
Hmm.
we're going to bounce back up to some warmer conditions here pretty soon.
And I'm with you. I've driven around quite a bit of the Midwest here the last week or so, and harvest is moving along full swing, full bore. Let's talk as well South America. I know you wanted to mention that here today. What are we looking at in Brazil and Argentina as they're getting their planting season rolling?
Yeah, I mean, it's rained. I watched the satellite drive rainfall numbers go through, and there's moisture that's been had in those areas, and so they're trying to plant. As you know, on Friday they released the newest update for Mato Grosso. They're right on their 5-year average, so they're behind pace from last year, but it's not like it's of a concern yet. But we know that 90% of the soybean crop, is planted in a place like Mato Grosso in October. So if the rainfall is coming through that area, then we'll be in better shape for getting them
Hmm.
to plant fast. Now, if you wanted to go model cherry picking and you did not want them to plant fast, you pick the GFS. It's drier. The European is wetter. Which one's been more correct? Well, probably the European model has been better.
Hmm.
And even if it is a little drier, they're probably still going to plant fast anyway because they do not want to worry about the monsoonal rain shutting down early on that safrinha crop. Problem is, both models do agree on one thing: very wet conditions south and east in Brazil, which means we're going to have flooding issues in those areas, which is going to cause a lot of replant if anybody did plant. And it's also going to delay folks there. So if there's a delay in planting, I don't think it's on dryness. I think it's on wetness in the southeastern part of Brazil. So that's a different narrative than I think a lot of people are carrying right now.
That is interesting and something that we need to keep an eye on for sure. I know as well, Tropics. We're kind of winding down the tropic season, but you mentioned to me you're watching something in the Eastern Pacific, right, Eric?
Yeah. So this has been a weird year, right? We've had an El Nino develop. El Nino normally shuts down the Atlantic. It didn't. We had 18 named systems this year. We're way above average on our accumulated cyclone energy. Where do we not have tropical cyclones? We didn't have them in the Gulf. There was Idalia and Harold, and that was really it. Okay, there's a system coming through us late this week. It's going to leave a front that's going to stretch from Maine to Florida to the Bay of Campeche, which is north of the Yucatan Peninsula. I'm going to watch that one because if it sits there, it could serve as an initiation point for some storms. But that's not the thing I was telling you about before this. It's on the other side of Mexico in the East Pacific where there is a 90% chance of development. And given the current wind field that is expected to be where this storm is going to form, it may blow it right across Mexico and get some of its moisture into Texas. In fact, if there's a wet spot in the central United States over the next 10 days, it's Texas. It's Texas and then parts of the Canadian prairie. Everywhere else in between is drier. And you mentioned hurricanes. Man, nothing would be better. I hate to say it this way, but nothing would be better than a slow moving, weak hurricane to hit New Orleans and follow the river all the way to Minneapolis. Because if it did, we would get that Mississippi River up. As it stands, that area is going to be relatively dry. There's a chance for storms coming through later this week, of course. There's storms going to be in the plains. They're going to try to move through parts of the Midwest, but the front loses some of its luster. And if it puts down rain, it's not enough. It wets the soil. It gets things wet
Hmm.
and we dry out after that. So Mississippi River this morning at Memphis, still 10 feet below low stage. We're going to have to really question how quickly we can bring that moisture up. We need mid-October rainfall to really begin an increase. Are there signs that it could? Sure. But how much can it outdo persistence? Persistence would tell me to tell you, be on the lookout for drier conditions to continue. But the pattern is open. It's moving. Nothing's blocked. So it could go. And when it does, it's going to close up those harvest windows. So I'll just say the same thing I said last week. If you got your guys ready and they're there, if everyone's there to drive, go harvest. I mean, get it done as fast as you can because we can't guarantee the second half of October is as open as it is right now.
Good thoughts as always, Eric. Before we let you go, anything we haven't mentioned that you want to reiterate or mention today?
I'm just going to say this as something that you and I are going to talk about for the next 5 months.
Hmm.
This El Nino, as it's developed, has yet to actually control the pattern. Summer drought in the Midwest, that was a Bermuda high. Really wet weather in the Western United States, nothing to do with El Nino. Had everything to do with the Big Ridge in the Midwest. We then get ourselves into this part of October, and I'm seeing, oh wow, big El Nino, but the MJO is dominating. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation is dominating. The tropical season is dominating. Every long range weather forecast model, which we're going to get a whole new suite of them all this next 2 weeks, they're all going to give you an El Nino winter look. Wet south, drier in the Pacific Northwest, mild north compared to average, colder south compared to average. And I'm sitting here going, all right, you're giving me the perfect El Nino forecast, yet El Nino has not fully engaged to give us anything up to this point. And I may have been on the El Nino bandwagon too long. I may have given it too
Mm.
much credit because that's what history would tell me to do. And I'm just going to tell you that I'm not convinced that all these long range forecasts are going to pan out well because I don't think that this El Nino is giving up, or excuse me, is taking over control of all the subseasonal things. And I think the subseasonal stuff is going to dominate. So that's like the MJO progression, or that's like blocking in the North Pacific or North Atlantic. Those things I think are going to control the pattern more than El Nino. So I'm a little, like, come on, El Nino, get your act together so that I am better at my job. I mean, that's really what it is. I want El Nino to dominate because it makes me look like I'm a genius, and it's not. So, you get frustrated sometimes when things don't pan out the way you hoped. So that
Yeah.
would be my closing thought for the day. We'll see how I feel next Monday.
All right, fantastic. Well, folks, in the meantime, could find more information ag-wx.com. You can sign up for Eric's weekly weather newsletter there as well. Eric Snodgrass, Nutrient Ag Solutions. Always good to chat with you, my friend. Have an awesome week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good. See you, Jesse.